Mars, the red planet, is in trouble. Something has perturbed its orbit. Mars is off track and plunging toward the sun. Problem is, that trajectory puts the red planet on a collision course with Earth. Fiction, maybe, but make no mistake, the odds are that such an impact has already rocked Earth to the core and dealt us the luckiest blow.
The Earth apparently really was hit by something nearly the size of Mars. We got a moon out of the deal, and it was a good job, too, because the Earth would be a very different place today if we didn't have the moon.
Our moonless proto-Earth, awaiting that lucky strike.
Earth Mark I, the planet that existed before the moon-forming impact, was completely destroyed by this impact event. And the Earth that we live on today, Earth Mark II, is a completely different planet than it would have been had the moon-forming impact not occurred.
It's a simple question, but only recently have scientists pondered, what if we had no moon? If we had no sun, there'd be no life on Earth. Indeed, there'd be no Earth. But what of our nearest celestial neighbor, the moon? Without it, there'd still be an Earth of sorts, but devoid of land-based life. Pluto is the only other planet with a relatively large single moon, but these tiny remote bodies are icy planetoids and don't really count. Jupiter, largest of the planets, has 16 moons, but like those of the other gas giants, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, these moons are comparative dwarfs. Jupiter and its satellites resemble a mini solar system. Mars has 2 diminutive moons, most likely captured asteroids. In certain ways, Venus is Earth's twin, but the similarities don't stretch to a sidekick. Venus is moonless. So too Mercury, barely bigger than our moon and closest planet to the sun. Within the solar system, only Earth has one big, lucky moon. How come?
You don't want a theory that's so evolutionary that it happens to every single planet, because then Mercury should have a big moon, and Venus should have a big moon, and Mars should have a big moon, and they don't.
If Moon and Earth form together in the embryonic solar system, like Earth, the Moon should have a big iron core. It doesn't, so the theory is suspect. What about the capture theory? Does Earth take hostage a passing planetoid? No dice. A body as big as the Moon just keeps on going. A third theory has the semi-molten proto-Earth spinning so fast that a lump breaks from the equatorial bulge. But the physics don't add up. As NASA prepares to go to the Moon, scientists seek a more plausible explanation.
Harold Urey, the geochemist who was involved in the early planning for the Apollo missions, made some remark that none of the 3 theories work, so the Moon must not be there at all.
But the Moon is there, and from 1969, 6 missions ferry 12 astronauts to the lunar surface.
I was strolling on the moon one day.
But the first Apollo landings are about flags and footprints. Later, though, astronauts look for so-called Genesis rocks, material dating back to the formation of the Moon. Do they solve the riddle of the origin of the Moon? Altogether, Apollo missions return 840 pounds of moon dirt and rock to Earth.
2, 1, 0. This is the ignition. What a liftoff. And liftoff. Roger, ignition.
As soon as the first Apollo expeditions came back from the Moon, there were a series of annual conferences in Houston to look at the rocks that they brought back and talk about the chemistry and the properties of these rocks. People called them the rock festivals. There was one every year.
The results are disappointing. The rocks resemble those in Earth's mantle. They contain no water and little iron. These are no Genesis rocks, and no wonder. Over billions of years, a cosmic bombardment had destroyed the oldest rocks on the lunar surface. To a degree, the hunt for Genesis rocks was a fool's errand. Man walks on the moon, and the origin theorists are little the wiser.
A number of scientists got together and started thinking, you know, it's been about 10 years since the end of the Apollo expeditions, and we were supposed to be learning about the origin of the moon and the early history of the moon. Why don't we have an answer yet?
By concentrating on rock analysis alone, Hartmann believes his colleagues missed the big picture. Impacts, he's convinced, are the clue. The moon is a stark record of 4.5 billion years of strikes from space. And the moon's taken some mighty whacks, not immediately obvious from the hemisphere that faces Earth. Prior to Apollo, when the hidden lunar face was barely known, Hartmann had tried to map the craters at the edge of the visible hemisphere. In a lab, he and a colleague set up a special globe.
We projected the very best photographs on that globe and walked around to the side and discovered a whole new class of features that people had missed. Big concentric scars, which are giant craters, 1,000 kilometers across. And that was one of the links in my own thinking, that the moon had suffered large impacts and that there were very large bodies running around the solar system crashing into the planets at the beginning.
And for every impactor on the moon, 25 hit Earth. By 1984, Hartmann is certain. The small iron core, the bone-dry rocks like those in Earth's mantle, the moon has to be formed from the mother of all impacts. That impactor has to be the size of a planet. But can worlds collide? From Russia, a new theory of planetary formation suggests they can and do. Our infant solar system is a maelstrom. From a vast primordial cloud, particles clump together. They grow as big as basketballs, aggregating, colliding. Soon they're like mountains. The process takes up to 100 million years. We're in the final stages of shaking out the planets. A planetoid blasts the mantle off Mercury. Debris heads for Venus. Beyond is Earth, third rock from the Sun. But next, in the gap before Mars, an extra planet, a rogue stranger called Orpheus. It orbits too close to Earth. On the next approach, cataclysm.
It's a very elegant idea, this idea that occasional big collisions affected the planets, because it allows us to explain why one planet has one type of system, another planet has another type of system. And yet, if you back off far enough and look at the planets in gross detail, they are relatively similar. So you get the similarities, but you get these individual quirky differences.
Venus, for instance, rotates backwards, the result probably of a great smash. Mars has a similar tilt to Earth, a clue maybe of another great impact. The gas giant Uranus rotates on its side, knocked over by a body the size of Earth. Enter a world leader on impacts. Based like Hartmann in Tucson, Arizona, Jay Melosh is skeptical of the Orpheus theory, but he's keen to test it.
As scientists, we are very interested in what happens when two planets collide together. But we'll probably never be able to do experiments with actually colliding planets. And so we have to find some other way of getting the information about what happens during a planetary collision.
Melosh turns to impact specialists, the military.
What we do is the same as the military when they are faced with a problem of determining the effects of above-ground nuclear explosions. We go to a computer code.
Across in New Mexico, a chance word with an insider gains Melosh access to a computer at the Sandia National Laboratories.
This is a classified computer, and so I wasn't allowed to touch the keyboard. My colleague asked me questions about inputs to the problem. And he, for example, asked me, what's the diameter of the target? And I gave him the diameter of the Earth. A few heads came up in the room. Target's the Earth. Then they asked the diameter of the projectile, and I gave them half the Earth's diameter. A few more heads came up around us. And then the velocity of the impact, 11 kilometers per second. Finally, because of the enthusiasm of everybody in the room for this gigantic collision, it was run under highest priority. The results came out. We could see collision of a planet. We could see this massive blast of gas coming out. And it was that kind of simulation that allowed us to go a lot further in understanding what happens in this impact event.
So how is it when worlds collide?
You've all seen movies of colliding planets and things like Star Wars where planets blow up instantly. That's not the way things really work. Planets are so big, things happen slowly. If you stepped back from the Earth 4.5 billion years ago on that day when the planet Orpheus collided with the Earth, you'd see things happening in apparently slow motion. Orpheus would come in, a body about half the diameter of the Earth, and slowly, slowly smash into the Earth, penetrate it, and clouds of vapor would shoot out, but all over about 20 minutes to half an hour. The collision, in fact, would make a lot of vapor that would squirt out. And vapor doesn't obey the same rules as solid rock does. It expands under internal pressure. And that actually allows a fair amount of material to get into orbit around the Earth.
Hartmann gives us the impact. Meloche puts the debris into orbit. But how does that debris form a moon?
It's really sort of a random chance what body collides with what other body to yield the final planets. One of these chance collisions happened to occur at just the right angle with just the right speed to form our moon. And when you view it in that way, the fact that Earth ended up at such a habitable distance from our sun with our large moon seems to be a very fortuitous event.
No such luck for Mars. 2 little satellites, one of them destined to hit the planet. An impact smashes an inner moon of Uranus. It leaves the planet with a set of rings and a reconstituted satellite, the moon we know today as Miranda. Saturn and its rings, billions of particles, as small as sand grains, as big as trucks. The rings are probably the remnants of a moon, one that strayed too close and was torn apart by Saturn's pull. Or perhaps the moon was pulverized by an impact. Either way, the rings are too near Saturn to remake a moon. They're within what astronomers call the Roche radius. Outside the limit, moons can form. Inside, material spirals into the planet, the future fate of Saturn's rings.
The specific type of impact needed to form a moon as large as our moon is actually fairly unique.
Had Orpheus hit head-on, Earth wouldn't have a moon. The angle of impact would throw up a ring of debris, but because it was within the Roche radius, the debris would rain back to Earth.
Yet in other cases, we find that after an impact, perhaps we form 2 moons that are actually stable for tens of thousands of years.
Canup tries every angle in her Orpheus impact models. A third of her simulations yield 2 small moons, but they're unsustainable partnerships. Alas, 2 moons wouldn't last till today.
What a sight that would have been to have 2 moons in the sky, in very close to the Earth.
With 2 moons, the smaller inner moon either falls to Earth, or the moons ultimately collide. But to produce our moon, Canup takes the most oblique approach.
We found that if you made the impact occur at a very off-center angle, so that the impactor almost missed the proto-Earth entirely, that configuration was very good at placing material into orbit. An off-center impact partially destroys the impacting body, which then passes away from the Earth and temporarily recoalesces before coming back in again for a second hit.
A double whammy.
The entire impact process probably took on the order of a couple days, but it would have been a very bad weekend to be on the Earth.
But our prize is the Moon. It forms just outside the Roche radius, 14,000 miles from the surface of Earth Mark II. Accumulating ejecta from a hot disk of debris, our Moon rapidly coalesces in from just 1 to 100 years.
If we had been on the Earth right as the Moon formed, say 100 years after the impact, the Moon would have been truly an enormous sight in the night sky. When you viewed the Moon right after it formed, it would have appeared 15 times as large in the night sky as it does today. That would have been quite a sight.
On our devastated planet, it's hell on Earth. Volcanoes spew. The crust heaves. Lava rolls like an ocean. The Moon is so close that rock and magma are tidal. The lunar pull is 4,000 times greater than today. Earth writhes and belches. In the seas, every wave is a tsunami. Gradually, through 4.5 billion years, Earth cools and calms. Initially, vast tidal forces cause the Moon to rapidly pull away. The spin of both bodies slows. Our day lengthens from 4 hours to 24. Tidal action continues to slow the spin of Earth and keep the Moon in retreat. Scientists know by examining rock layers called tidal rhythmites. They show the frequency of prehistoric tides. Marjorie Chan of the University of Utah hunts rhythmites in Big Cottonwood Canyon. Eons ago, these were layers of sediment left by tides in a river estuary.
Some of these tidal rock layers are just paper thin, and it's like each piece of paper is a story or page out of a diary telling what's happened a billion years ago.
Chan's findings are rock solid. Primitive tides are more frequent, and the days far shorter.
It's amazing that these tidal rhythmites can tell us that a day was only 18 hours long, because we can count some of the tidal rhythms. We can see how many rhythms were in a day, how many days were in a month, how many months were in a year. And we use those calculations to show how the Moon has been moving away from the Earth over time.
From 14,000 miles at the start, the Moon is now 234,000 miles from Earth. Today, when all three bodies align, the Moon can precisely cover the Sun. On Earth, we see it as a total eclipse, an astonishing cosmic coincidence. Such eclipses are further evidence that the Moon is receding from Earth. This is a total eclipse today, but it looked like this when the Moon was closer to Earth. In future, when the Moon is further away, a total eclipse will be a thing of the past. Ancient eclipse records reveal that as little as 2,000 years ago, day length is fractionally shorter than today. Had it been constant, the solar eclipse of 136 BC would have followed this line of totality. Instead, because the day was then shorter by a 20th of a second, totality sweeps east through Babylon. More than a quarter century ago, Apollo astronauts set up reflectors on the Moon. Today, they're targets for astronomers at the McDonald Observatory, Texas. By bouncing laser beams off the reflectors, the speed at which the Moon is receding can be measured to within a hair's breadth. The gap is widening by 1.5 inches a year. From this, over 4.5 billion years, the Moon in our skies has shrunk to this. The Moon's gravitational pull keeps Earth on an even keel, an average tilt of 23 degrees. By contrast, Mars lacks a big moon stabilizer. Consequently, it wobbles on its axis. Over millions of years, the tilt can vary from 0 to 90 degrees, playing havoc with its climate. Imagine Earth like this. In Paris, at the Bureau de Longitude, astronomer Jacques Lascar does just that. What would happen to Earth, he wonders, without our big, lucky moon? First, he models Earth with the moon. Our axis may move in a circle, but always at 23 degrees. Remove the moon, and the circular movement slows, but Earth goes loco. Lascar's calculations spell chaos. Take out the moon, and we lose all stability. Earth reels around the inner solar system. Lascar has no doubt we depend utterly on our partner in space.
If we had no moon, the axis of the Earth will wobble chaotically between 0 degree and 90 degree. And the climate on the Earth would change dramatically. So we can say that the moon is a climate regulator for the Earth.
Even with the moon, Earth suffers many wobbles. As a member of a NASA team seeking the origins of life, Lynn Rothschild knows that even the smallest change in tilt has profound effects.
There's some researchers in Germany that have proposed that the reason that civilization on Earth started in the Nile Delta region and not the Sahara, where there were large groups of humans at the time, was because of the obliquity of the Earth shifting less than a degree.
North Africa's lush Sahara turns brown and barren. Today, it's Earth's biggest desert, product of a planetary teeter.
Without the moon, we would be getting shifts in obliquity of 20, 30 degrees, 40 degrees, 50, more. And so compare that to this change in obliquity of less than 1 degree that caused the mass migration of humans, and you can start to imagine what a serious issue this would be for life on Earth.
So, as we lose the moon, there's cause for concern. Could this be Egypt as Earth starts to wobble? Is this the Sahara of the future? Does Antarctica become a blazing desert? These are the prospects if we lose the moon and Earth tips over.
You suddenly have summers that are incredibly hot. Over land, you're talking about maybe over 100 degrees centigrade, over the boiling temperature of water. On the other hand, you have winters where you're well below freezing, maybe as cold as even dry ice, incredibly cold temperatures.
Ice sheets advance and retreat across the equator. Worse still, as Earth wobbles chaotically, the polar caps melt, the oceans flood, islands disappear, our coastal cities are inundated. It's a fact. The moon is leaving us. The further it goes, the less it will stabilize our planet, and the slower Earth will rotate. Our day will get longer and longer. One means of slowing the moon's retreat could be dam building, not across rivers, but oceans. It's science fiction, but we have millions of years to develop the technology. We're losing the moon because of tidal friction. Reduce the ebb and flow of our oceans by damming them, and we could slow the rate of the moon's recession. Equally bold is the idea of the late Alexander Abian of Iowa State University. He suggests hijacking a moon from Jupiter and parking it in Earth orbit. This moon, Europa, is big enough for the job. It doesn't replace the moon. Europa just helps keep our planet upright as the influence of our moon declines. But full moon spells trouble ahead for hospitals, prisons, and the streets of any city.
It just seems as though something tends to happen when it gets a full moon. You always seem to have some kind of problems. It just seems to be something in the air that gets people excited, sometimes in the wrong way.
From new moon to full moon, science explains the lunar phases. They're because only half the moon is sunlit, and we see a varying amount of that half. What science doesn't always explain is the effect of these phases on terrestrial life. Why is the practice of certain yoga thought to be dangerous at full moon? Are more babies born at full moon? Does the moon's 29.5-day orbit of Earth, the lunar month, influence the menstrual cycle? For primitive man, full moon means that he has light to hunt. There's a theory that this has locked the menstrual cycle to the lunar cycle. While men hunt, women can afford to be infertile. But in the dark days around new moon, when men are at home, women should be fertile for the survival of our species. In nature, once a year, pololo worms rise to the ocean surface to mate on the night before a new moon. Easy pickings for these South Sea islanders. Coral spawns on the Great Barrier Reef. It only happens at full moon in November, the lunar signal for 1,000 species to reproduce. When tides are highest at new moon and full moon, sea turtles come ashore at night to lay their eggs, the safest time to incubate the young. As the moon regulates tides, so tides regulate habits. Only at low tide do these sand-burrowing crabs emerge. On the Galapagos Islands, marine iguanas anticipate low tide by up to 2 hours. It gives them a head start on the way to the feeding grounds they share with fur seals. The French wine harvest. Growers here believe that at full moon, lunar influence is high and maximum energy flows to the grape. So in France, growers like to pick around full moon. And they rack at new moon, when lunar influence, they claim, is lowest, sediment least perturbed, and the wine clearest. Life on Earth is undoubtedly subject to the rhythms of the moon. What's now emerging is that the impact that formed the moon may have hastened life itself. Greenland, 1999, and a jaw-dropping discovery.
We are flying into camp at this very remote place in West Greenland, and you can only get here by helicopter. And from the camp, we will walk out to the site where we will open chapter 1 of the history of Earth.
3.8 billion years ago, this rocky outcrop is part of an ocean floor. As a native Inuit, Minnick Rosing is first to tap its secret.
So this is the oldest rock on Earth. This is the oldest material you can put your hand on, and if you want to touch something that's older than this, you would have to go to the moon to find it.
But moon rock, however old, contains no hint of life. Back on Earth, Rosing's Greenland rock does, and that's his great discovery. These layers contain carbon, evidence of complex plankton. That plankton exists so early predates previous estimates for the start of life by 200 million years, pushing it back closer to the lunar forming impact.
That was really mind-boggling experience, because life was not supposed to be on Earth at that time, and if it was, definitely it was not supposed to be in life forms that could have lived in the open oceans.
Previously, early life is thought to exist only in extreme environments, feeding off the gases of deeply submerged volcanoes. This man brilliantly explains the Greenland findings. As a member of the National Academy, he advises the US government on science. Norman Sleep believes the moon-forming impact of Orpheus kick-starts life.
Earth Mach 1 died when Orpheus hit. This is Earth Mach 2. If we are on Earth Mach 1, we'd be now under 3 kilometers of water. We'd have no oxygen to breathe.
Sleep's theory is radical. Orpheus blows off half the oceans of Earth Mach 1 and conjures a new atmosphere. quite possibly there's aquatic life on our protoplanet. Earth Mark I isn't short of water. Orpheus may have life too. But that impact takes no hostages.
The impact completely restores the Earth to a clean slate. Any life forms that existed on either the Earth or Orpheus, that was the end of them.
But his hunch is that Orpheus actually kindles life on Earth.
There may be a direct connection between life getting going on the Earth and the moon-forming impact.
Sleep believes that, like Earth Mark I, Orpheus has an iron core. On computer, these cores are blue. So violent is the impact, they merge.
When Orpheus hit, large amounts of iron were mixed into the Earth. This iron reacted with water, produced hydrogen. This produced a reducing atmosphere, which is essential for life getting going.
Pass electricity through it, like lightning, and the precursors of life may spark. In 1952, a celebrated experiment does just that. Simple amino acids are created in a test tube by Hal Urey and this man, Stanley Miller. But they lose favor as colleagues insist early Earth lacks the right conditions, a so-called reducing atmosphere. But now we know the Orpheus impact may have produced that atmosphere. But suppose there is no impact. How does our planet fare?
Earth Mark I would just be ocean. You might see a few small pieces of land sticking up, a little bit of Tibet, maybe the top of Hawaii, Mount Everest, but it'd be essentially covered with water. Without the impact, we'd definitely not have humans on the Earth. This documentary might be being made by other life forms, but they'd definitely not be humans.
We can only speculate about the creatures that evolve on Earth Mark I.
It's really fun to try to figure out what life would be like on the Earth. Would we have intelligent life? If we hadn't had the lunar forming impact, I think life on land would be very different. In fact, there might not be life on land at all.
And with no moon to slow our spin, Earth is hostile and frantic.
You would have a very fast rotating Earth. With just the sun and no moon, we'd have very fast days, about 3 times as fast as we have today. Sun up, sun down would all come much quicker. Everything that goes on during the day would be much faster.
And a grotesque climate. Winds howling at hundreds of miles an hour. Non-stop dust storms. No human could evolve here.
So you really have to turn to the aquatic environment and think, well, what in the aquatic environment would be considered intelligent? Octopus and its relatives are all rather intelligent. They can do things like actually build little houses for themselves with their tentacles. They can, to some extent, have feelings. They have eyes that are almost dead ringers for vertebrate eyes. They're absolutely fascinating. And so you sort of have to picture that the cephalopods, the octopus and the squid and so on, are really going to be the geniuses of a moonless Earth.
But with the moon, those cephalopods don't evolve to rule Earth Mark II, or even our oceans. Most perish in the impact 65 million years ago that slays the dinosaurs. Mass extinctions occur about once every 100 million years. In the past, the moon could have shielded Earth from such impacts, but statistically the chances are small.
To an evolutionary biologist, I don't really care as much about statistics. All I need is one impact that would have affected evolution. And the fascinating thing is that there's no way to prove it. There could have been a time that the moon actually protected us, actually saved us by being at the right place at the right time and intercepting an impact that otherwise would have done severe damage to life on Earth. In other words, caused a mass extinction.
The moon may have saved our planet. It's about to become our stepping stone to other planets.
As chance is a very important aspect in planetary growth, the moon can be viewed as a symbol of luck. If a tiny dust grain were moved very slightly, early in the history of planetary growth, by the width of a human hair even. That could affect a collision 1 million years later. Orpheus might have missed Earth altogether.
Perhaps sending it careening into Venus.
This could produce a system which would be very similar to our terrestrial planet system today, except that Venus would be left with the large moon rather than Earth.
Leaving any intelligent life on Earth marooned on Earth.
3, 2, 1, 0, and liftoff of the Lunar Prospector spacecraft on a voyage to rediscover the moon.
But since we have the moon, we have the chance to colonize the solar system, and we're on the way again.
I've always looked at the moon as a complete world. People tend to forget it is a world. It's a very big place. The surface area of the moon is equal to North and South America combined.
But despite a fleet of probes and 6 Apollo landings, our celestial partner remains a relative stranger.
Here we are with a complete world that we know virtually nothing about. I make the analogy quite frequently that if you had 6 crews spread over California and they worked 3 days, you'd never found the gold, you'd never found the oil.
And you'd never have found the water. Water delivered billions of years ago, it's thought, by comets. Deep in dark craters at the lunar poles, ice may lie preserved. The clue comes in 1998 when Binder's probe, Lunar Prospector, detects hydrogen, a possible sign of water.
The amount of water that we're flying over right now is roughly equivalent to that we think is found frozen in the polar regions of the moon using the data from Lunar Prospector. If this is the case, then we are ready for lunar colonization.
If water's confirmed, it's worth its weight in gold.
We wanted to get people back studying the moon and understanding that this is the future of humanity and it's the beginning of the colonization of the solar system. And I believe the Prospector has done that. I want to see humanity on the moon, and I want to see humanity spread throughout the solar system, and this is the beginning point.
As Lunar Prospector runs low on fuel, Binder has an idea. He targets a crater at the South Pole. Would a deliberate impact splash up the proof of water? Sadly, no. But it was a long shot. David Gump is the new generation, a space entrepreneur who plans a commercially funded mission to the moon. At his base in the Mojave Desert, California, Gump has the prototype of a reusable rocket. From Earth orbit, it's to launch a lander to search for water.
There is no actual proof that water is there. So our robot will land at probably the South Pole, near what's called the Peak of Eternal Light, and then go into one of these permanently dark craters at the poles to see if there is ice that could be recovered to make our first space oasis. If we can confirm that useful quantities of water actually exist at the lunar poles, it means we could refuel our spaceships there, and it means that missions to Mars and missions deeper into the solar system finally become feasible. It's the first time we could actually sort of live off the land as we explore space.
Gump's vision hinges on lunar water. It sustains life, and split into liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen makes rocket fuel. His moon is a spaceport.
I think the moon is crucial to having a stepping stone to the rest of the solar system. The solar system is a really big place, so having a training ground where we can prove ourselves and our equipment close to home, so if there is a problem, you can call for help, is crucially important. If you're on the way to Mars and you have a problem, you're pooched.
If there's water, lunar colonies are next, but not the cool modules of science fiction. More the adobe structures of the Mexican deserts and the U.S. Southwest. Moon pioneers will fashion their accommodation from lunar dirt. NASA is taking note.
The next time when we go to the moon, our suits are going to be very high technology, but we will have to depend on basic natural resources for our dwellings.
The watchword is economy, living off the land. the first moon dwellings could resemble these huts at a museum of traditional building in California.
Every pound of material we carry from here to the moon, it costs 2 to 3 pounds of gold. Therefore, it's vital to be able to utilize what exists there.
Tubes filled with moon dust and stacked in coils.
It seems to be ironic that we are going back into history. It really is not going back into history. It's taking the best of what civilization has given us and moving it forward into the future.
Like the roller coaster? Here, space architect Thangovelu meets rocket scientist Anthony Zupero. The topic is transportation and the cheapest way to get off the moon.
You think this is going to be similar to what we find on the moon? I suspect
so. Could this lift us from the moon? A magnetic levitation ride that puts us on course for Mars. NASA is funding development. With 1/6 the gravity of Earth, it's 100 times cheaper to launch space vehicles from the moon. But imagine spending 3 years in here, headed for Jupiter.
Weer geen promotie gemaakt. De Power Zone, vanavond om 12 uur op Discovery Channel. Met Discovery.
Drenkeling Zuidkant Maasbrug over.
Waar we ook zijn. Wie we ook zijn. Allemaal delen we die fascinatie voor het licht dat onze adem doet stokken.
Silhouet van een auto, grijze Saab, kenteken IF36GD.
Donderdagavond op Discovery is Crime Nights. Elke donderdag vanaf 9 uur.
Space is horrible. You have to have some gravity or your immune system doesn't work. Your bones become chalk. You gotta have gravity. The only way to get gravity is to have this big spinning device and you're thrown against the walls.
And that's what Zupero plans, a gigantic ring inflated with water ice from the moon. Ice stored at a filling station in lunar orbit.
You don't build your spaceship, you inflate it. You have a plastic bag the size of a football stadium that looks like a huge tire, and you inflate the walls with water, you've got an ice spaceship.
The ring spins, and within it the travelers have gravity. Water ice stored in the walls powers a steam rocket. For the return, refueling is on one of the icy moons of Jupiter.
I never would have figured that a steam-powered rocket, a clunker, would take 100 times more than the next best rocket.
Through which all these things are perceived, was a flying machine with its 2 passengers, landing on its closest celestial neighbor and returning from where it came. Perhaps again, God's irony lies somewhere within this great boast of humankind. The building of the tallest tower for the sole purpose of standing out among the races was never finished. The machine that was so great that it was said to be untouchable by even God never completed its first voyage. And finally, the crowning achievement of humankind, the greatest boast of the species, the event in human history most associated with pride in our own accomplishments, landing on the moon. 20 years later, and years behind schedule, the same space program couldn't put into Earth orbit a telescope with a lens that focused. And yet 2 decades earlier, a mission 100 times more complicated worked on its first occasion. With close scrutiny of the motives of the zealous Nixon administration, a critical examination of the entirely government-controlled press coverage, and newly discovered footage of the crew of Apollo 11 staging part of their mission, we wish to detail what may come to be the greatest government conspiracy of all time. A funny thing happened on the way to the moon.
I'm convinced that in the space field, the Russians are ahead of us, particularly in large weightlifting capability, and that at the moment the problem is not so much to catch up, but first build up the working speed that they have already demonstrated. After we are running as fast as they do, there's still a considerable gap to close, and only the future will tell whether we'll manage to close that gap.
We cannot and will not ever get into this race as we should, so long as all of our objectives are short-term objectives. We've got to have no finite end to our objectives. The end of our objectives should be as far as we can see at any given time, but right now we need a 10 to 12-year program that has as its ultimate goal the manned domination of space. And if we don't, we're going to be in trouble.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
We must assure our preeminence in the peaceful exploration of outer space, focusing on an expedition to the moon in this decade.
T-minus 60 seconds and counting. We passed T-minus 60. 55 seconds and counting. Neil Armstrong reported back when he received the good wishes. Thank you very much. We know it will be a good flight. Good luck and Godspeed. 40 seconds away from the Apollo 11 liftoff. All the second stage tanks now pressurized. 35 seconds and counting. We are still go with Apollo 11. 30 seconds and counting. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 25 seconds. 20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6.
Unbeknownst to the citizenry, high above the Earth, beginning at an altitude of 1,000 miles and extending an additional 25,000 miles, lay lethal bands of radiation called the Van Allen radiation belts. Every space mission in history with humans on board, from both the United States and Soviet Union, from the first in 1961 to the present, has been well below this deadly radiation field. Mercury, Gemini, Soyuz, Skylab, the Space Shuttle, all maintained altitudes well below 1,000 miles. All except Apollo. The more experienced Soviets spent 100 hours in space for every 20 hours of the US. In order to survive the hour-and-a-half journey through this radiation field necessary to reach the moon and return, solid lead shielding between the astronauts and the exposure outside would be required. The mammoth Saturn V rocket used by Apollo was already 35 stories tall and weighed as much as a battleship. To add additional tonnage in the form of a lead barrier completely surrounding the crew members would have made it impossible for the vehicle to get off the ground. That is why the Soviets, though more advanced, only sent an unmanned probe to the moon. The Apollo spacecraft's narrowest shielding was less than 1/8 of an inch of light aluminum. In 1998, the Space Shuttle flew to an altitude of 350 miles, one of its highest altitudes ever, hundreds of miles below the beginning of a field of radiation that was so severe that the astronauts inside of their shielded spacecraft and inside of their shielded spacesuits saw flashes of light with their eyes shut that they described as shooting stars, due to radiation penetrating first the shuttle's shielding, then their spacesuit shielding, then their skulls, and finally the retinas of their closed eyes. As a result, CNN issued the following report noting NASA's unpredicted surprise. The radiation belt surrounding Earth may be more dangerous for spacewalking astronauts than previously believed. Scientists say the phenomena known as the Van Allen belts can spawn killer electrons when the Earth's magnetic field changes. These electrons that are being studied could have an important effect not only on satellites, which has happened in the past, but could also affect the astronauts by creating large doses of radiation that could influence their health. The electrons can penetrate through various materials, including spacesuits, and can pass through, in fact, the walls of the space station, and can create high charges deep inside of these objects. President Kennedy, a man of political, not scientific background, set the irrevocable goal of landing a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s, just days after America's first astronaut had spent a mere 16 minutes in space, not even achieving a single orbit around the Earth.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
We take an additional risk by making it in full view of the world. But as shown by the feat of astronaut Shepard, this very risk enhances our stature when we are successful.
The technology necessary to launch the massive Saturn V rocket and an intercontinental ballistic missile is 95% similar. When the Soviet Union launched mankind's first satellite, Sputnik, in 1957, there was grave concern that they had mastered space ahead of the United States and might use this advantage to launch a first nuclear strike from an orbit high above North America. When they also put the first animal in space, then the first man in space, then achieved the first spacewalk, the first crew of 3, and the first ever of 2 simultaneously orbiting spacecrafts, concern turned to fear and then horror as America watched their communist enemy achieve all these firsts with no hope in sight of ever catching up.
President, a member of Congress said today that he was tired of seeing the United States second to Russia in the space field. I suppose he speaks for a lot of others. What is the prospect that we will catch up with Russia and perhaps surpass Russia in this field?
However tired anybody may be, and no one is more tired than I am, it is a fact that it's going to take some time, and I think we have to recognize it. They secured these large boosters, which have led to their being first in Sputnik and led to their first putting their man in space. We are, I hope, going to be able to carry out our efforts with due regard to the problem of the life of the man involved this year. But we are behind.
If it was impossible to better the Soviets in the space race, which was really a race of technological armaments, what could be done? How could America offset the threat of superior weaponry? Throughout the history of rivalry and war, astute generals of lesser armies than their counterparts have used deceit and misinformation as a method to achieve victory. In World War II, for example, columns of inflatable tanks were placed at locations afar from Normandy to draw German forces away from the real location of invasion. The Star Wars missile defense program rigged tests to make it seem more advanced than it really was. That's the conclusion of the General Accounting Office. The aim was to fool the Soviet Union about U.S. military readiness during the Cold War. Certainly, it was not possible to fool just the Soviets about U.S. strategic capability in the 1960s, while somehow informing 200 million Americans of the truth secretly. In order for them to believe the United States had the capability to go to the moon, everyone would have to believe it. Furthermore, the pride of a nation was at stake, and the goal of a martyr not to mention the growing unrest domestically of a government throwing tens of thousands of lives away in a foreign war riddled with contradiction and ambiguity. In addition, the Apollo program had already spent billions of dollars. If it failed to achieve its goal with such an investment, it would indeed be a large and bitter pill for the taxpayers to swallow. The cost of the program, whose sole goal was to be the first to plant a flag on the lifeless rock just outside the Earth, if adjusted for inflation to the 21st century, was $135 billion. With a profit margin of just 7%, this would be equal to over $9 billion profit going to the privileged contractors chosen by their friends at NASA. If the machinery was in fact only achieving Earth orbit, as other earlier missions had already done, then the completion and functionality of the other components would not have been as important, and even more profit would have been made. $135 billion could feed 2 million people for their entire lives. It could also buy 2 million two-bedroom houses. Yet how could such an undertaking be kept secret, and for such a long time? To the latter, one needs only to remember that an unsolved riddle 6 years older, the assassination of President Kennedy, still daunts the minds of the vast majority of Americans. As a parent of a conspiracy, as his assassin being assassinated himself, the truth of the matter has still escaped history. In keeping a secret of the magnitude of the Apollo missions being fraudulently created, one turns to the Manhattan Project for comparison. Surreptitiously building the first nuclear bomb during the early to mid-1940s involved 129,500 people over a 3-year period. Yet the secret did not get out. A quarter century later, the art and technology of espionage inevitably improved, narrowing dramatically the number of players in the know of a large clandestine operation. Just 1 year before the first mission to the moon, NASA launched the Tetra satellite, specifically designed to simulate flight data coming from the moon, so that the ground crews could rehearse the landing, much as the astronauts did in their own simulations. Had it not supposedly fallen back to Earth, all that would have been needed during the actual flight would be a repeat of one of these computer programs, with a few original variations, transmitted to the satellite for rebroadcast to Houston. Scores of computers and their deceived operators on the ground would then receive prearranged information, including the alleged location, altitude and fuel consumption of the spacecraft, as if it were descending to the moon's surface. If the Soviets tried to find the actual location of an Apollo crew in the hundreds of thousands of miles surrounding the Earth and the moon, it would be tantamount to trying to find a rowboat in the Atlantic Ocean. The fact that the Apollo program was so departmentalized, with various construction and test sites around the country, meant that only a few people saw the whole picture. And for the first time ever, there was no independent press coverage of such an historical event. Whatever pictures and sound were distributed to the public were strictly controlled and previewed by the federal government. They were then disseminated unchecked until this hour. For who would realize that the unthinkable was not only possible, but absolutely true? And what of the photographs? What do they tell us? On 3 separate occasions, our office asked NASA's Public Relations Department for every single picture of an astronaut on the surface of the moon, just during the maiden voyage of Apollo 11. Many duplicates were sent. In all, fewer than 20 pictures were found, including first-hand investigation on site at the agency's vaulted archives. Quite surprising, considering the historical significance of the event. These very photographs are the same ones circulated year after year on anniversary commemorations. It is estimated that in just the first 60 minutes on the moon, motivated by the tenuous nature of the circumstances, many more exposures could have been expediently taken. Also surprising is the scarcity of photographs of the mission's chief pioneer, Neil Armstrong. The greatest achievement in human history, and of the man whose first step echoed around the world, dawning a new age of scientific enlightenment, there is only one full-body picture of him on the moon, besides this ghostly reflection. This one. taken by an automatic camera mounted on the side of the lunar module. Perhaps he feared liability should the whole conundrum later become unraveled. Perhaps he has forgotten that he attested to the authenticity of the event with his signature on this plaque engraved by the federal government. In fact, in the more than 30 years since the event, aside from NASA's initial press conference and the occasional brief anniversary remarks where few questions were permitted, he has never given one on-camera interview to anyone, ever. From an analytical standpoint, photographic anomalies have to be sought out with an understanding of lighting and shadows. The most straightforward is simple. When objects are lit solely by the sun, as all the scenes on the moon were said to be, after all, lighting equipment was not only impractical, it was unnecessary in bright sunlight, then all shadows, regardless of the landscape, will run parallel with one another and never intersect, as shown by this example. In these seldom seen photographs, obtained from a rarely used auxiliary NASA archival site, it is clear that these scenes were lit with artificial light. These shadows, which are cast at different angles, are evidence that a second light source is being used. In addition, the sun would not cause an isolated hotspot like this, only an artificial light would. Again, intersecting shadows and another hotspot. And again. And again. It is simply impossible for this picture to have been taken with sunlight on the moon. Here, the shadows are shown to be as black as pitch. And yet here, completely in a shadow, the astronaut is lit up like a Christmas tree. How can this be? Or this, on the shadow side of the lunar module. In this magnification of an Apollo photograph, a rock, very likely a papier-mâché prop because of the crease here, is categorized with the letter C. In later releases of the same picture, the letter is gone, probably airbrushed out. Here a crosshair, which was burned directly into the image from the film plate, and thus should always appear on top of the objects in the photograph, appears behind the object in this scene, clearly revealing a composite of two pictures into one. Someone apparently forgot to create a burn crater underneath the lunar module's 10,000-pound thrust engine, despite the fact that during ground tests there was a real concern for the vehicle falling into the hole the engine created as it descended. Here is a Norman Rockwell depiction drawn just 2 years earlier based on the latest specifications and scientific data. In these enlargements, it looks as though the lunar module was simply placed there. Not even one speck of moon dust on the landing pod. As a result, all subsequent flights had to have the same discrepancy, which was explained away by the effect of no atmosphere. And what about stars? On the moon, with no atmosphere, they must have been quite a sight to behold. Yet there is seldom any mention of them, if ever, by any of the astronauts on any of the missions. Undoubtedly, creating a mural with all the constellations properly placed in the sky would have been virtually impossible to create accurately, much less realistically. A competent amateur astronomer would have been able to call attention to the slightest error in measurement. The answer? Not to talk about the stars. Ever. In their post-flight press conference, it was the only question to which Neil Armstrong responded with an absence of memory.
When you looked up at the sky, could you actually see the stars and the solar corona in spite of the glare?
We were never able to see stars from the lunar surface or on the daylight side of the moon by eye without looking through the optics. I don't recall during the period of time that we were photographing the solar corona what stars we could see.
I don't remember seeing any.
Years later, though, Michael Collins would remember seeing the elusive stars and wrote about them in Expeditions to the Moon. It seems his memory improved the older he got. Why don't stars appear in any of the photographs? Simply because the proper, mostly closed exposure setting for the camera's iris, set that way to compensate for the bright sunlight on the moon's surface, completely diminished the faintness of relatively distant specks of diminutive light. This answer is true. It does not, however, explain why they never took any pictures of the stars by themselves, with an exposure setting perfect for them. While they took 3 automobiles to the moon, they never took a photographic telescope. Had they done so, they would have been able to see farther into the universe than had ever before been realized. If they had taken a telescope and were not actually on the moon, they would have had to concoct undiscovered galaxies that might one day prove to be non-existent. The cost of the 3 moon rovers in 21st century currency? Nearly $60 million each, though they had fewer parts than a Jeep. Where was all this money going? Then there's the flag, blowing in the wind at least twice on the atmosphereless moon. We can only guess that most of the missions were staged inside for fear of possible aerial or satellite reconnaissance from an unfriendly nation. The backpacks, designed for 1/6 gravity, must have had the cooling systems removed to allow for movement without falling over. With very near and hot studio lighting, that left one hot astronaut inside. Assuming that it was the astronauts inside after all, their faces were always covered. The necessary mammoth amounts of air conditioning were probably responsible for the air current. Here the editor cuts to a still shot of the flag, just as the effect becomes noticeable. Here it is unchecked. This rare clip, attained decades ago, was never re-released with the inevitable increase in experience and scrutiny. To demonstrate 1/6 gravity, a bouncy, floaty feel to the astronauts' movements would be similarly achieved with relative simplicity. Slow motion. You are viewing the scenes as they aired more than 30 years ago. Now let's look at them with the speed doubled. It becomes discernible that they are, in fact, in Earth's gravity, and are no more leaving the ground than they would on Earth. It is clear from these rarely seen color television pictures that the crew of Apollo 11 brought a high-resolution color video camera with them on their mission, yet the only pictures broadcast live from the moon's surface were these from a low-definition black and white camera. In fact, the networks complained because in addition to this, they were forced to shoot the images, second generation, off of a projection TV of the technology of 30 years ago, and were not even allowed to take a direct feed, which further degraded the quality and clarity of the images. Perhaps this was precisely what NASA and the federal government had in mind. After all, it was a first, regardless of where they were. Better to open up their debut mission with fuzzy pictures and numerous blackouts, rather than show too much revealing detail of a false scene that was yet unproven. And finally, the element that seals their fate. Of all the footage of Apollo 11 requested from NASA over a 5-year period, one gem was discovered just before the completion of this documentary. An old reel received by mistake. It contains the raw or unedited footage of the crew of Apollo 11, Michael Collins, Edwin Aldrin Jr. and Neil Armstrong, staging part of their mission for nearly an hour in living color, with exceptionally clear behind-the-scenes audio of conversations discussing the techniques used to achieve a disingenuous picture depicting the Earth at a distance, in order to falsely demonstrate their far journey from it and their ability to survive passing through the Van Allen radiation belts. It cannot be misconstrued that this staging was done for some other reason prior to the mission, for the reel itself is slated and dated July 18th, 19th and 20th, 1969, the very days of the mission when they were said to be approaching and achieving lunar orbit. Furthermore, it is apparent they are in genuine zero gravity aboard the actual spacecraft, necessary to convince the mass media of their authenticity, just not any further than Earth orbit, as you will see. In this never-before-seen or heard footage, not only is the radio conversation between the astronauts and Houston Control audible, there is a secondary, private conversation taking place between the crew and a third confidential party, prompting the astronauts with what to say, when to speak, and how to effectively manipulate the camera to achieve the desired misleading effect. NASA claims that the Houston transmissions were the only ones taking place with the astronauts. Listen now as Houston Control initiates a conversation with the crew, only to find them too preoccupied with the behind-the-scenes trickery to respond. Moments pass and the oversight is picked up on by the clandestine third party, who quickly prompts them with talk. Immediately, Neil Armstrong speaks.
Hello, Apollo 11. Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great. Over. Okay, Roger. We're coming in on Earth.
Again, the illusion they are attempting to create is the Earth at a distance to demonstrate their far journey from it and their ability to survive passing through the Van Allen radiation belts. Understand, too, that only about 20 seconds of this raw footage was ever broadcast to the public, and these conversations discussing their deception were believed to be private, until now. Here they discuss that these television transmissions were in fact not broadcast live as everyone believed. They were first screened and edited for playback later.
Roger, Neil. We just wanted a narrative such that we can, when we get to playback, we can sort of correlate what we're seeing. Thank you very much.
Here they discuss the fact that they have turned out the lights and have blocked out sunlight from entering the spacecraft through the other windows, as to not cause any reflected light to fall onto the spacecraft's wall in the foreground.
Okay, very good. Well, we shut out the sun coming in some of the other windows into the spacecraft, so it's looking through the number one window, and there isn't any reflected light.
The reason this was done is so that the truth of the matter would not be revealed. It is this. Though the federal government would have you believe that this is a view of Earth from a distance out of the spacecraft's window as it nears the moon, it is not. What they have ingeniously done is placed the camera at the back of the spacecraft and centered the lens on a circular window in the foreground, outside of which it is completely filled with the Earth in low orbit. The circumference of the window then appears to be the diameter of the Earth at a distance, with the darkened walls of the spacecraft appearing to be the blackness of space around it. That is why they wanted the interior dark and blocked out the sun from entering through the other windows. Here you can see the extruded window, probably 2 inches thick at the bottom. This is because the Earth's shine is coming in at a downward angle. It also causes the Earth to appear to be an irregularly shaped circle, for you are seeing the outside of the window at the bottom and the inside of the window at the top, which together form 2 different sized halves of a circle. Subsequently, this take was never used. As they perfected the shot, a crescent-shaped piece of black material was inset slightly into the window to create the illusion of the Earth's terminator line dividing night and day. It is uncannily convincing. During this segment, intended to be edited and played back later for the worldwide television audience, dated July 18, 1969, Neil Armstrong condemns himself as he states that he is 130,000 miles out, or halfway to the moon, as the NASA flight log also states on this date, when he is in reality in low Earth orbit of a few hundred miles.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 11. Calling in from about 130,000 miles out.
Here, during another segment, also intended to air after review, Neil Armstrong falsely explains to the viewers how the shot is attained by putting the camera's lens to the window's glass, as it would have to be if they were the claimed distance away from the Earth.
We only have one window that has a view of the Earth, and it's filled up with the TV camera.
If the window was completely filled up with a TV camera, as he stated, then an astronaut's arm would not be able to get between the camera and the window, as it obviously does here in this outtake.
South America becomes invisible just off beyond the Terminator or inside the shadow.
You can also notice how the astronaut operating the camera reacted to the mistake by attempting to pan away from it.
see white bands of major cloud formations across the Earth.
This is a segment that they believed wasn't even being recorded, much less suitable for broadcast, for the lens was being zoomed out and the scene was being changed to that of an interior of the astronauts at work, and apparently the stop button popped back up on the recorder without notice. Here is the diffused work light that they used to see camera controls, but not throw light onto the spacecraft's wall. Here they remove part of the crescent insert. Finally, the iris is opened up and you can see the real location of the camera and the very bright and near Earth out the window. Here is the slate for the 19th of July, and the same shot of trickery on the 19th of July, and then the 20th, and the same misleading shot on the 20th. Later that evening, they were said to be walking on the moon. How can this be when they were in Earth orbit only 9 hours earlier, and the moon is some 3 days' journey away? Furthermore, if they genuinely went to the moon, why would they be faking any part of it? Why this trickery with the window? By faking being halfway to the moon, it becomes apparent that they did so because they could not even go halfway. It thus confirms that the stumbling block to their success was the lethal radiation of the Van Allen radiation belts. Since the same equipment was used on the subsequent missions in the 40 months that followed, none of them could have gone to the moon. They only increased their proficiency at staging them. When some TV viewers of the second manned mission to the moon telephoned the networks complaining that reruns of I Love Lucy were being interrupted, it became clear that for the taxpayers, once was enough. But it wasn't enough for the government and contractors. Billions of dollars of pure profit went with each return. How coincidental that the following mission would have the element of life and death jeopardy. Apollo 13. Now the public would take going to the moon more seriously and be reconnected with the drama. We now realize that perhaps the reason Neil Armstrong has never given an on-camera interview is because he doesn't want to lie anymore. What threats may have been made upon such honorable men or their families to possess their reluctant cooperation and later ill feelings towards perpetuating this still darkened hour in American history. NASA's highest-ranking official, James Webb, resigned without explanation just days before the first Apollo mission. Why, when he was on the threshold of achieving the greatest accomplishment of his career? All 3 Apollo 11 astronauts also resigned shortly after their return. On the 25th anniversary of the event, in 1994, Neil Armstrong made a rare public appearance and held back tears as he spoke these brief cryptic remarks before the next generation of taxpayers as they toured the White House.
Today we have with us a group of students among America's best. To you we say, we have only completed a beginning. We leave you much that is undone. There are great ideas undiscovered, breakthroughs available to those who can remove one of truth's protective layers.
He is that layer. Perhaps someday soon, with the uncovering of this footage and its meaning, the true patriots of America will rise up or come forward and free the citizens and themselves from the sin that so easily entangles and from a federal government that needs to have the gangrene cut off. Even if the government's destruction would come from the truth, then it is not worthy to stand, and its betterment would inevitably follow. All of us are mortal. All of us will die. Perhaps the seeking of a clear conscience before that hour will motivate the truth into the light. Perhaps as citizens we should offer amnesty for this and other crimes of history, for facts from those involved, before the truth perishes with them. Why must we wait until the year 2017 to open the Kennedy assassination files? Perhaps they will not even be opened then, for the law that reluctantly stipulates their release says so with this clause, quote, with the exception of documents certified for continued postponement by the President. Whoever believes the citizens to be too immature for the truth are too immature for power. The truth will always set us free.